Hi, this is Joe and welcome back to the shop. We've laminated in 4 plies of 1/4-inch plywood as part of a transom replacement. As you see here, I have a bunch of clamps in place. What I've also done, and I'll show you the inside in a moment, I have a series of sheetrock screws screwed in from the back of the boat in through the transom to make sure it pulls that wood tight while the epoxy is curing. Here's a shot from the inside of the boat. You'll notice that we have the 2-piece transom material. I had to do that in order to get the piece of plywood down in past where the subfloor is, and then epoxy the top portion with the tabs up underneath the top of the boat. So again, each of these pieces of 1/4-inch were cut at different heights, and then as the plies were put in, epoxy was put into the slit so that it would become a solid piece. I did the first several plies of plywood off camera because I wanted to review my procedures and make sure I got the best way. So on this ply that I'm going to put on, I'll show you this on camera. As you can see, the screw heads are the screw bodies coming through here and here and here and all the way across the plywood. That again puts, as those are screwed into the plywood, it pulls it tight so the epoxy will cure without any voids on the previous ply of plywood. So I'm going to go and pull all the clamps off, unscrew all the screws, and then I will show you how I laminate a ply in, so you get an idea of what it takes to do a ply. Doing it this way is not the most optimal. I don't have a way to take 3/4-inch plywood, heat it up or steam it, and then bend it. It would be much cheaper to do it that way, but by having to go 1/4-inch plies, I've had to use a lot of resin. So if you're doing your own transom and you have a way to steam the plywood, I would recommend doing that. Doing it this way with 1/4-inch plywood and having to shape the plywood into that curve, again, it uses lots of epoxy, and epoxy is very expensive. So let's pop the clamps off, unscrew the screws, and then I'll show you how I put on a ply of plywood. We're going to we're using West Systems 403 microfibers adhesive filler. This is really good for in between plies of plywood. What we're going to do is mix up a rather thick mixture to fill in the gaps around the edges of the plywood and across the center where the gap is. And then what we'll do is we'll come in and mix up some more epoxy with the same filler, but this time, or that when we get ready to do the actual majority of the epoxy, we're going to mix that thinner so it will spread out, and then when we put the next ply of plywood up against the one that's already epoxied in, it will spread out and form a better coating on the plywood, so there won't be any voids in between the plies. But the first coat of epoxy, you want it rather thick because you want to fill in all the crevices and the crack across the center, and you don't want that epoxy to run. You want it to be fairly thick. That way, that will give you enough time to work to put in the thinner filled epoxy to then bond the 2 layers of plywood together. So I'm going to mix up some epoxy and filler. Again, remember, always put the epoxy and the hardener together. Mix it first, then put your filler in and mix that second. Otherwise, the epoxy will not mix properly, and you may get some spots that won't cure properly in the epoxy. So let's go ahead and mix up some, and I'll show you how I'm going to fill in those cracks and crevices. I like using the West Systems epoxy, very high-end epoxy, and I like the pumps. The pumps allow you to, it's a 2-to-1 ratio, so the hardener and the epoxy have different size pumps to maintain the proper resin, and then all you basically do is you do a pump for pump in each container, and it automatically measures the appropriate amount of resin ratio for you. So in mixing up, we're going to do a stiff filler first to fill in the cracks. We're going to do 8 pumps of each, mix up the epoxy, and then we'll add the filler, mix that up, and then we'll start applying it to the crevices. So I'll do that here for you to show you. I use these polyethylene mixing sticks. What you want to do is you want to mix the epoxy till you think it's thoroughly mixed, and then you want to mix it a little bit more. What I'm doing is I want a longer set time, so I usually use the they have a 205 and a 206. One's a slow hardener, one's a fast hardener. I usually like to use, if I'm doing large surfaces, I want to use the slow hardener. It gives me a bit more working time, but yet it still cures nicely overnight, so I can come out the next day and put on another ply, and it's pretty well cured after 24 hours. So we're going to mix this up some more, and always mix and make sure you get on the sides of the container. You really want to mix this epoxy well. Now what we're going to do is we're going to get some of our filler, and for 8 pumps, usually 1.5 is going to give me 160 milliliters, or 3/4 of a cup on this little container. And as you see, if you look inside, it's pretty thick. As it starts to get hard, it starts to ball up a little bit. And that's what you want when you're mixing epoxy to fill cracks. And you really want to mix that in so it's well wetted. You don't want to leave any of the filler to remain dry. You really want to mix that in. You want to get up on the sides of your mixing container. And example, see, it's not dripping that much off of the stick. So that is a good mixture to fill in crevices. As you can see, at this consistency, the filler goes right into the crack. It stays there. It doesn't run out. So, and this will give me plenty of time to fill in all the crevices on the edges of the plywood, across the center of the plywood. Then we'll mix up somewhat of a less thick ratio. Again, you want, when you put the plywood between plies, you want it to be able to flow freely, to squeeze out and cover all areas of the plywood. You don't want any voids in there. So I'm going to go ahead and on camera I'll fill these crevices in, show you, and then we'll mix up another batch. Using the slow hardener is going to give you just about an hour of set time, which should be plenty for mixing, filling, and then putting on the in-between ply coats. So you don't want to dilly-dally though, you want to get it on and get it in the crevices and then get the epoxy on. To get the best strength, we want to make sure we fill the crevices between the plywood and the whole of the boat, because you want, when that epoxy cures, it's going to then bond the plywood to the hole on the boat. So you want that as strong as possible. So you want to fill in all those crevices and make sure they're level. Okay, as you can see, the left side is pretty full. I'm going to go over and do the right side. I'll do that off camera, and then we'll come back and we'll mix up some more epoxy for the plywood to plywood coat. Okay, as you can see, we have all the crevices filled, so we're now ready to mix the epoxy. What I'm going to do on this coat, I'm going to mix about 15 pumps of epoxy and then mix somewhat less of the filler, and that way it will smooth on almost to the stage of runny, but not quite to where it will run down the sides. Again, you want that, when you put those, sandwich those two pieces of plywood, you want that stuff to spread out to get a good bond. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up about 15 pumps of epoxy off camera. You already seen me do it once. And then we'll come back, we'll spread it on, and I'll show you how we then set up and clamp and screw in the next ply. And then that way, if you decide then to do yours, you'll understand what it takes. As you can see, the epoxy is now running off the stick, so it's not as thick. And again, we want it that way. So now what we're going to do is spread the epoxy on. My battery is dying here, so I'm going to kill this video right now, replace the battery, and then we'll continue where we left off. Okay, now we're going to spread the epoxy on. If you leave the epoxy in the pot with a lot of volume, it's going to kick a lot quicker. So you want to get this stuff spread out pretty thin, and then that increases your set time. Again, you sit it in there. The more volume you have in the cup, the faster it's going to kick. So you want to spread it out, give you more working time. I happened to hit it lucky. 15 pumps gave me just enough. If you are a little short, just quickly mix up another batch, put it on. You have plenty of work time. Always pre-fit your plywood. You don't want to get epoxy on here and then find out your pieces aren't cut properly. Otherwise you'll be screwed. So make sure everything is pre-fit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start screwing, and I'm going to reposition the camera to the back of the boat, and we'll get these screwed in so they'll cure in a really solid manner. Okay, we have the ply epoxied and screwed on with all the screws and the clamps. Let me pan here for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to let this sit overnight, and then we'll put on the final 6th layer. I'll probably do that off camera. Now we're going to go clean up the epoxy mixing cup and all the utensils, so that way you can use it again. If you don't clean it up, you basically have to just pitch it away. So hope you enjoyed this video. Next video we're going to be prepping this plywood and getting ready, sanding the interior of the hull, so that when we come in with the 1708 biaxial glass, we're going to start laminating that in. And as I mentioned in an earlier video, we're going to use vinyl ester resin. It's much cheaper than epoxy, and going in over the transom, it's going to be good enough. Vinyl ester has very similar properties to epoxy, but it's about half the price. Better than polyester resin. So what we're going to do is we're going to prep all that and start laminating in the glass in the next video. Hope you enjoyed this. Please feel free to comment. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you a lot.